Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. Imagine, if you will, that you're peering through the dust of a forbidden, centuries-old archive. Today, we're taking on the role of historians, trying to unpack a massive, almost incomprehensible cultural revolution. We're looking specifically at Chapter 79 of Solomon's 72 Demons, an era that's famously known as the Choosing of Banners. But here's the twist. We aren't looking at this from the high and mighty perspective of the great lords who started the whole thing. Instead, we're examining these deep political fractures through the meticulous, quiet record-keeping of a lowly infernal scribe attached to Earl Andromalius. Now, you might be wondering, why is this ancient breakdown of hierarchy so fascinating for us to study today? Well, it's because the shift we're about to explore, that precise, fragile moment where unquestioned, ancient hierarchy completely breaks down, and the mid and low ranks stop taking orders blindly and start taking sides, it perfectly mirrors the collapse of rigid power structures throughout our own human history. When the people at the very bottom realize that they're the ones holding the foundation together, the entire empire shakes.
So, the absolute crux of this entire era is anchored right here in this singular, highly forbidden phrase. It was literally scrawled by a lowly scribe in the margins of an infernal record, and it sparked this massive shift from mere silent service to active, dangerous political choosing among the ranks. To really grasp the gravity of this, you have to realize that writing this down was essentially committing treason in ink. I mean, in a rigid, absolute monarchy, questioning your place isn't just frowned upon, it's a death sentence. But this scribe documented a terrifying new reality. You see, a question asked once in the dark is just a whisper. But a question written down, read and shared, that becomes a road. This simple, quiet sentence transformed the very culture of the ranks, taking them from unquestioning instruments to active political agents who suddenly realize, wait a minute, we actually have the leverage to weigh our options here.
Now, before we even start examining the great kings and the distinct banners they raised, we really need to understand the true weight of the lower ranks. For absolute ages, high kings used the word legion just as a decoration to show off their power. They treated it like a static number carved onto a monument. But a legion is actually a living, breathing mass of rank-and-file demons who were slowly, terrifyingly waking up to their own agency. Think about this in terms of real-world labor movements. For centuries, the working class was viewed simply as machinery, right? But the moment those individuals recognized their collective bargaining power, the exact moment they realized that the master's wealth and authority rely entirely on their own sweat, the entire dynamic flips. As we'll see throughout this deep dive, this transition from silent service to political choosing fundamentally and permanently eroded the traditional authority structures of this dark world.
So, opening the ledger to Chapter 79, here is how we're going to map out this revolution step by step today. First, we'll explore the birth of infernal choice. Then, we'll contrast the opposing ideologies of Bael and Paimon, followed by a look at the ambitious banners of Belial and Asmoday. After that, we'll dive into the pragmatic middle path offered by the princes, understand exactly how the legions found their true power, and finally, look at how the scribes actually archived this coming betrayal.
All right, let's start with Part 1, the birth of infernal choice, moving from a mere whisper to a road.
The questioning of high-ranking authority actually began super quietly in the shadowed corners among messengers and watchers. These were the demons whose whole job was carrying commands from one rank to another, and crucially, they started doing something very dangerous. They began to compare notes. They compared the conflicting orders they were given. They compared the brutal punishments being doled out. And they started to notice which high demons treated them as capable instruments and which treated them as just expendable smoke. In short, servants stopped merely waiting and started actively measuring their lords.
At this early stage, for the absolute lowest ranks, choosing a banner wasn't about career advancement or some grand sweeping ambition. It was strictly a survival strategy. It's kind of like corporate restructuring rumors spreading through a giant office. You aren't necessarily looking for a promotion. You're looking at the impending fracture of your entire society and deciding where you are least likely to be crushed when the ceiling inevitably falls. The high ranks initially just laughed at the rumors, utterly oblivious to the fact that their halls were filled with servants who were no longer just serving, but actively listening and planning.
Let's move to part 2, Bael and Paimon. This is where we see the clash of order versus intellect.
So the primary ideological breakdown forced the lower choirs into a really stark choice between the safety of absolute loyalty on one hand and the rebellious pursuit of personal knowledge on the other. We see a massive, almost jarring contrast between Bael's merciless black gold claim of firstness and Paimon's scholarly hall, which was filled with instruments and memory masks. You see, Bael operated on ancient entitlement. He didn't even bother to recruit, he simply claimed ownership. To Bael, the very idea of a lower rank making a choice was a profound insult. He demanded absolute loyalty by origin. On the totally opposite side of the spectrum, Paimon refused to answer Bael's threat with another threat. Instead, he answered with a gathering of minds. Paimon's banner didn't command silence from his subjects. Rather brilliantly, it made silence speak.
This created a really profound psychological divide among the mid-ranks. Those who sought safety and stability above all else, like Sabnok's fortress builders, naturally submitted to Bael's rigid hierarchy. Bael commanded strictly through fear, functioning very much like an ancient mob boss. He offered absolute safety and certainty in a highly chaotic time, but the cost was zero dignity. You were completely protected, sure, but you were forever reminded that you were nothing more than dirt beneath the crown. Now contrast that rigid hierarchy with the highly intellectual approach of Paimon. Paimon actively invited scribes, translators, and thinkers whose power wasn't military at all. He offered interpretation and deliberately called his followers minds instead of servants. Because of this framing, demons who were demanding intellectual respect, like Buer's philosophers, flocked to Paimon. They wanted power to be intelligent, and they consciously made the choice to pursue personal knowledge over absolute, unthinking loyalty.
That brings us to part 3, Belial and Asmoday, the banners of ambition, representing status versus force.
If Bael and Paimon represent order versus intellect, then Belial and Asmoday represent two wildly different flavors of pure ambition. Looking at how our lowly scribe recorded these shifts, once we move beyond just safety and knowledge, the infernal record reveals two distinct pathways for demons pursuing raw advancement. Belial's elegant promise of elevation feels like a dangerous, incredibly subtle temptation. Asmoday's furnace, however, is the literal, violent birth of transformation. Belial raised a banner of flame and favor, specifically targeting the hunger for recognition among the diplomats and courtiers. Asmoday didn't even bother raising his banner in a grand council hall. He raised it down in a filthy forge beneath a red glow, speaking of force made beautiful. It is fascinating to contrast how Bael commands through sheer fear, while Belial manipulates through promised status advancement. Bael just wants you to kneel because he was there first. Belial, acting much more like a manipulative corporate executive, invites you to climb the ladder, but only just high enough so that you serve him better. Belial essentially offers career advancement. He provides a door where there used to be a wall, intentionally turning a lower demon's hope into an insatiable appetite. But then, on the other extreme, we have the raw forge of Asmoday. Asmoday completely redefined the professional identity of artisans, metalsmiths, and weapon makers. He looked at them and told them that absolutely no empire, no king, and no banner exists without the makers of its weapons. He transformed them from passive, underappreciated tools into active conquerors, demanding proof of warlike desire. So if we summarize these four core ideologies, Bael is the safety of absolute order, Paimon is the respect of intellect, Belial is ambition achieved through status, and Asmoday is ambition achieved through brutal force.
Let's look at part 4, the princes as the middle path, navigating the corridors of hidden politics.
The reality was that a great king's banner was just too massive, too final, and frankly, too dangerous if the political winds suddenly shifted. Because of this, the princes and dukes offered a smaller, far more personal alternative. When we look at this mapping of how specific demon professions aligned their unique skills, it clearly shows how individual temperament heavily influenced the choice between seeking absolute stability or risking it all for radical change. Fortress builders aligned with Bael for safety. Philosophers aligned with Paimon for intellect. Diplomats chose Belial for access. Artisans chose Asmoday to forge their own destiny through force. But pay close attention to the scouts and messengers. They often aligned with princes like Seere. Why is that? Because a prince's banner was essentially a middle management safety net. Seere offered an ideology of swiftness and movement. For a scout whose very life depends on agility and speed, your allegiance should never become a cage. The princes essentially offered a highly pragmatic way to survive the massive power structures without being entirely swallowed up by them.
In our analysis of these records, we absolutely must also note Phurkes the knight, who stood entirely alone on his pale horse. Phurkes looked around and declared that all the banners were fundamentally flawed and incomplete. He saw that kings wanted obedience without ever having to prove their virtue, and the lower ranks wanted recognition without deciding if they actually desired justice or if they just wanted a turn at being the oppressor. Phurkes proved to the absolute lowest captains that refusing an incomplete banner is a deeply powerful political choice all on its own. It was judgment held in reserve. Refusal, especially in a world demanding loyalty, is an act of ultimate defiance.
Okay, moving to part 5. Legions learn their true weight, and the immense power of the lower ranks is realized.
This right here is perhaps the most pivotal moment in our entire historical analysis. The infernal culture fractured permanently when the individual rank-and-file demons realized a profound, earth-shattering truth. The absolute loudest crown is utterly powerless without their compliance. This quiet realization spread like a second rebellion. It proved that every high demon was suddenly terrifyingly vulnerable to the very obedience they had taken for granted for centuries. Think about the massive leverage here. Bael had supreme authority, sure, but authority required movement from the ranks to actually enforce it. Belial had grand promises, but promises required believers to manifest. Asmoday had roaring fire, but fire required someone to shovel the fuel. A king's crown is heavy, but it fundamentally requires the necks of the lower ranks to support it. The lower spirits finally woke up to their own immense agency within these massive power structures.
Using a terrifying arithmetic of numbers, the lower spirits discovered something incredible. They didn't even need to fight a physical war to win. They could simply use passive resistance to make their ancient kings entirely inefficient. Look at these 4 deceptively simple steps. Delay the command, misdeliver the message, mistranslate the text, or simply wait. I want you to imagine the catastrophic real-world impact of this. Imagine a critical command for battlefield reinforcements being mistranslated on purpose by a resentful scribe. Entire wars could be lost, not to enemy swords, to a strategically misplaced comma. If enough of the legions simply decided to wait an extra hour to march, the most ancient, powerful order would arrive too late to matter. This collective,
quiet, passive resistance completely and permanently eroded the traditional top-down authority structure.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 6, Archiving the Coming Betrayal through the Final Earl's Ledger. Let's pull all the way back to our main perspective, the historian analyzing the record keeper. As these massive factions solidified, the mundane act of record-keeping itself transitioned into the single most dangerous political weapon in the infernal court. Earl Andromalius became the ultimate archive of betrayal. He meticulously tracked the mid and low ranks who pledged to one banner publicly out in the grand halls while secretly serving another in the shadows. He watched the oaths being taken, not to celebrate their grandeur, but to silently gather evidence. Every secret pledge created a future accusation. Andromalius knew exactly who served Bael openly for safety, but reported back to Paimon privately for knowledge. Information, quite literally, became the ultimate currency.
Because of this intense surveillance, the ranks quickly learned to fear the quiet scribes far more than the roaring kings. Think about that massive shift in cultural power. A king like Bael could punish a rebellion with fire and physical force, but a record keeper like Andromalius could completely destroy a legacy just by proving hypocrisy. Choosing a side wasn't the ultimate sin in this dangerous new era. Pretending not to have chosen was. The transition from silent service to political choosing had permanently eroded the old ways. In a very real sense, the scribes had completely replaced the kings in terms of true terror.
And so, as we close this explainer of the source material on the dawn of chosen loyalty, we are left looking at a world utterly transformed. It became a world where every messenger might be a double agent. Every fortress builder might leave a hidden structural weakness in a wall for a rival king, and absolutely no command is ever pure again. I want to leave you with the ultimate question haunting these ancient archives, a question that shattered an entire empire. When every single command carries a hidden agenda, and your loyalty is the absolute only true currency you have left, who truly benefits from your obedience?